Good evening. Welcome to the Bible Speaks Today. And I was looking at the monitor and I was on the wrong camera. That's my fault. I should have listened to what they told me. But then we try very hard and occasionally we have a bad day. Have you ever noticed a news person get on the wrong camera when you're watching the news and they go, oh, that one, you know, same for me. Anyway, it's the Bible Speaks Today with me trying to fumble through it as usual. When you do these programs, or when I do these programs, it all looks, I hope it does to you, and it look fairly effortless and without, it looks like it's very easy. But what you don't realize is that before we actually start filming, I've got this production lady who's stuffing things behind my back to make me sit up, and the production people are threatening me with a strap around my shoulders if I don't sit up. I bet Dan Rather never had to go through that sort of stuff. Mind you, he was probably more professional than me and knew about it. Anyway, you'd be amazed at what detail these people get up to, Oh, no, where were we? Oh, yes, Bible Speaks. That's right. And we're in the Byzantium period now. Now, here's another little bit of homework for you. Go and look at your internet or whatever you use, your iPad, your iPhone, this sort of thing, and look up what the Byzantium period was, because it'll give you the dates. And while you're there, look up in the Arab Caliphate area. Now, remember in Jerusalem, we had these same periods. I'm trying to keep them the same. Now, Jerusalem went up and down in the different areas, depending on who was ruling it at the time. And it's the same with Jericho. There's a Christian pilgrim whose name I never did find out, but he's referred to, so whoever he was, I hope he knows who he was. But back in 333, he said that the built-up area of the town of Jerusalem of Jericho, I beg your pardon, was abandoned. So the town that was there was abandoned, and when I say the built-up area, that's the houses and all the rest of it, and a Byzantine Jericho. In other words, New Jericho, a new town, if you will, called Jericho, was built about a mile, it says a kilometre, 1.4 kilometres, so that's about a mile, to the east, around which the modern town is centred. So, if you go to Jericho today, you have Jericho, and then a mile away, up at the hill a bit, is the old town of Jericho, which is, of course, now a tourist attraction, that sort of thing. And that happens a lot. That's happened a lot with some of the towns and cities that are mentioned in the Bible, that the original town was abandoned. Either they didn't like it or too many unpleasant memories or what. And they start a new town over here, a couple of miles away, maybe closer to the water or closer to the road or whatever. Anyway, so they do. So, during the Byzantium period, as I said, Christianity took hold in the city, the new city, and the area became very populated. People in those days lived in Europe and said, let's go and visit the Holy Land, and they go to the Holy Land, and they realize that if they can cultivate some ground and build a house, they can stay there, and then life's a lot better than it was back in France or Italy or Spain or even England. Of course, the weather's a bit better too, so you know how that goes. So it gradually built up, and it became a big. Today we'd call it a tourist attraction. But there were half a dozen monasteries, and more than that, churches built. Each different group, the Franciscans and the brothers of this and the brothers of that, all built their own monastery. Now these aren't huge, big. When I say monastery, I'm not talking about something the size of St. Rita's or something like that. I'm talking about modest buildings, maybe just 10 or 12 monks in there, and a church whereby the visitors could go. And of course, they all have their claim to fame. There's one of the churches well known today, and it was then, is St. George of Kazeba. Now that's was built at that time, between 300 and 400, but it's still there today. In fact, it was built in 340 or something like that, so right bang in the middle. And there was a domed church. Now you may say, well, so what? Well, domes were quite of a tricky thing even back then. So a domed church, a lot of money spent on it, to St. Eliseus. I didn't know who St. Eliseus was. I had to look him up. Okay. And at least, now here's the thing, these are Christian churches, right? But then again, in the 5th or 6th century, 5th century I think, did I say? Yeah, 6th century, sorry. They built a couple of synagogues. So that gives you an idea that Jericho, fallen away, a new Byzantine type town was built, predominantly Christian, churches, monasteries, and now a couple of synagogues creep in there. Remember how Jerusalem went from synagogues to Christian churches and then back again and back again? Very much the same way. Okay? After the Persians invaded in 614, remember that date because I've got it written down here, but 614, the monasteries were abandoned because the Persians took over. It was part of the Islamic conquest, if you will. So all the monks got booted out, the monasteries got abandoned, okay? And then so we turn into the Arab Caliphate era, exactly the same way as Jerusalem. At the same time this was happening to Jericho, down the road in Jerusalem, the same thing was happening. Okay, the country had been taken over by the Persians. Okay, and Jericho by then was named Ariha, which is the Arabic name for it. Okay, but I'll use Jericho because it's easier. Okay, and it became part of the military district of Palestine. The word Palestine was used back then. It became part of the military district of Palestine, which itself was a part of an even bigger district. You know, it was like a subdivision of a bigger district. And there's an Arab, I guess he's an historian, writer anyway, called Musa Uqba, around he died in 758, but he recorded that the Caliph Umar ibn Khattab, who's quite a well-known chap in Arabic history, you've got to read it to find out, exiled the Jews and Christians of Khaybar, another town, and sent them to Jericho. Okay? So now we've got a situation where the Persians come in and kick the Christians out, leaving the Jews with their synagogues. The Arabs come in and kick everybody out, right, and put them in. And then they start moving Christians back into Jericho, probably because they wanted to have them where they could see them, I don't know. Or they wanted them out of Jerusalem. I looked to see what the tie-up in the dates was between the Arabs moving all the Christians out of Jerusalem. Remember we talked about that a few weeks ago? It doesn't quite match up. It's probably 90, 100 years difference, but perhaps, maybe, you know, it was the same sort of thing. Anyway, by 659, so we're still way back there, okay? The whole district, that big district I was telling you about, come under the control of the Umayyad dynasty. Now, the Umayyad dynasty in Arab culture is a big one. I mean, it's where a lot of the great Arab conquests took place. You know, most of the Middle East was conquered by that dynasty. Okay, and that year, an earthquake destroyed Jericho, the new town. Okay, destroyed it. 10, 20 years later, a pilgrim called Arkuf, and I don't know who nationality he was, and he writes, and he visited Jericho and found it in ruins, and all its miserable, his words not mine, all his miserable Canaanite inhabitants were dispersed in shanty towns around the Dead Sea, which is not too far away. Okay, so once again, Jericho, remember we said continuously inhabited, but at various times it was sacked, destroyed, abandoned, you know, walked away from, whatever. It has a very checkered history. There's a palatial complex in that area, long attributed to the Umayyad Caliph Hisham Malik, okay, who was around in 724, 743, and it's known as Hisham's Palace, is located. It's about a mile north of the old Jericho city. That still remains of that still there, okay. And the desert castle, which is again near there, was more likely built by one of the later caliphs. But they did some building around there. So Jericho, despite being technically abandoned and people living by the Dead Sea, they're still building the odd palace or whatever it was around there, okay? And of course, it's kind of interesting that the chap who built this new building there, this castle, was assassinated before he could complete the construction. But the remains of two mosques, a courtyard, a big mosaic, and other parts of the building can still be seen there today. Again, the unfinished structures were again largely destroyed in 747. So for 200 or 300 years, Jericho went through from being up here in a big place to almost in ruins, to back up, to be destroyed by an earthquake, and back up again. You know, it wouldn't be a nice place to live, to be perfectly honest, for that period of time. Okay? Now, the Umayyad rule, or the dynasty, ended about 750. It was followed by the caliphates. Again, these are like dynasties, okay? The Abbasid and the Fatimid dynasties. Dynasties like a royal family type thing, you know. You had the Stuarts and things in England and that sort of thing. Okay, the Arabs were really good at one thing, irrigated agriculture. They learnt, I guess if you live in the desert, you learn how to make water work for you. And irrigated agriculture, really, even the stuff that we use today, you know, the big irrigation things and monster machines and everything, the basis of all that is Arab, generated from the Arabs way back then. Okay, so because they developed this and seeing where Jericho was and the spring still there and all that, suddenly Jericho becomes the fertile city of the palms again. So it's on the upswing again. And in 985, one of the Arab geographers wrote that the water of Jericho is and I'm quoting here, is held to be the highest and best in all Islam. Now bear in mind that all Islam at that time stretched from Persia to Spain, most of North Africa and above and all around the Mediterranean Sea. So, you know, obviously it was pretty good. Mind you, if you've been walking across the desert for 10 hours and you come up to a nice cool spring, then it probably tastes good anyway, doesn't it? Anyway, he says that bananas are plentiful, also dates and flowers of fragrant odours. Well, we knew that because that's what it was centuries before, wasn't it? Nothing much has changed. And Jericho, he also refers to Jericho as one of the principal cities of the district. So it's probably at this time surpassing Jerusalem as far as size of inhabitants, because at this particular time, Jerusalem was one of its downslopes. But these two cities, it's so fascinating to read about them, because these two cities, up and down like this, all the time. Even today, I mean, we'll get to that in the later part of the programs, but anyway, well, and it flourished until, we're in the 900s, now we get into the 10,000, so in 1071, the Seleucid Turks invade, which then is followed by what? The Crusades. Okay, remember the Turks invaded Jerusalem, and then the Crusades come, you know, and then we have, while Jerusalem is fighting off Saladin, and the Crusaders are making a fortune building castles and taking the lands, Jericho's not so far away, it's affected by the same thing. In 1179, the Crusaders rebuilt the monastery of St. George of Koziba. Remember I talked about him? Okay. At its original site, 6 miles from the centre of town, from the centre of old Jericho. Okay. And they also built a couple of churches and monasteries, surprisingly enough, dedicated to St. John the Baptist. Now, I don't get the connection there, because there's nothing much about John and Jericho in the Bible, but of course, historically, who knows? And what is really interesting, and I did not know this, and I thought I knew pretty much a lot about Jericho because I've been studying it, that the Crusaders introduced sugarcane production into the city. Now, I mean, I know sugarcane goes in Jamaica and South America and this sort of thing, and I would not have thought of sugarcane as a crop for a land in the Middle East. I really wouldn't, but they did. Okay, and in fact, the site, Tuashin es Sukkah, the sugar mills. That's what it means. Holds that remains. I mean, that area still has the remains of the Crusader sugar production facility. So it wasn't just, we can't actually go see that. Oh, they made it here. Totally amazing. Okay, so here we go. That was in 1171. In 1187, the Crusaders get evicted by the Ayyub forces of guess who? Sir Aladdin. Okay, so he finished. And in fact, Jericho was conquered and occupied before Jerusalem was, because if you remember, your stuff from I was talking about a few weeks ago, Jerusalem remained under Crusader control with an uneasy truce with Saladin. In other words, but all the other cities were under Arab rule. They just left Jerusalem. It was easier than fighting for it. But eventually that stopped and they came in. And as I say, the battle of Hattin is in history books. Is where Jericho fell, and the town slowly went into decline. I guess anyone who was making a record at the time was here we go again. I mean, it literally up and down like a yo-yo. Okay. Under the Mamluks in 1226, an Arabic geographer, Hamawi, said Jericho has many palms, also sugar cane in quantities, and bananas, and the best sugar in the land is made here. That's in 1226. So obviously something still kept going there. And in the 14th century, this is really new, another geographer said there were sulfur mines in Jericho, the only ones in Palestine. Again, sulfur, all sorts of things you don't know, okay? The villagers possessed indigo as a sort of revenue. Remember they did some of that during the Roman occupation, if you remember, because indigo is like helps make purple, and the Romans were big on purple, weren't they? Okay, and there's a little side note I picked out here. You see these little side notes you get in books. Sometimes you read them, because this one says, using a cauldron to do this, specifically for this purpose, that were loaned to them by the Ottoman authorities in Jerusalem. Can we borrow your cauldron? Okay. But for most of the Ottoman period, and the Ottomans are coming, like, if you do much world history, the Ottoman Empire is something we kind of recognize as being not so far away, you know what I mean? But anyway, but for that period it was a small village of farmers who were susceptible to attacks by Bedouins, so they built defences. All the time roaming around that area are still free Bedouins. I mean, the Israelites themselves, we hate to think about this, but for the 40-odd years they were in the desert, they were free-roaming, marauding Bedouins. And that's what they did. There's a French traveller in 1659, so it doesn't change very much, and already we're up to 1659. He says that Jerusalem in that time Jericho, was desolate and consisted only of about 50 poor houses in bad condition. But the plain around is extremely fertile. The soil is fat, but it's watered by several rivulets which flow into the Jordan. Okay, so, but he says, notwithstanding these advantages, only the gardens adjacent to the town are cultivated. So obviously nobody bothered to work the fields anymore. It was just around the town, which is why there was only 50 people there, I guess. In the 19th century, Europe got really involved in travel to the Holy Lands. Read your history books. It's, let's go and see Jerusalem and Jericho and Damascus and all these other places. So scholars, archaeologists, and missionaries. Now, it usually goes that way. The scholars come first and say, wow, there's some interesting stuff here. And the archaeologists come along and say, yeah, look at that, that was biblical. And then the missionaries come and say, hey, we've discovered another place. But that's how it goes. But the first excavation excuse me, the first excavation at Tel as-Sultan, the original site of the original Jericho, was carried out in about 1860 something. 1860, I've lost it. And the monasteries of St. George of Kazima, and this St. George is a really, what's the word? Really hangs in there, because his monastery and the John the Baptist monastery were refurbished and completed in 1901, 1904. Quite modern times, okay? All right, now having got all that, I know it's a lot of information, but if you understand what Jericho's been through, you can understand what it means to the various people who today occupy Jericho, much as the people who occupy Jerusalem today. You know, it's not a question of saying it used to be ours, it used to be everybody's, right? And everybody's got a claim to it. You know, the Crusaders, and the Europeans, the Jews, the Armenians, the Turks, the Ottomans, the Seleucids, all of them say, hey, we were there, you know. So you can see why today, politically, so many people get so up in arms about things that happen in these cities, okay? In the modern era, so let's look at the modern era, you know. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, that was at the end of World War One. You remember, you know, the Allies, it was a sideshow to the main war in Europe, but the Allies came into Europe, Lawrence of Arabia, and you know, it was the Turks they were fighting. The Ottoman Empire is a Turkish empire, and of course they conquered everything there. So it came under the rule of the Mandatory Palestine. It was called, I forget the actual name of the thing, but anyway, under British rule, British military garrisons and that sort of thing. And the British built fortresses in Jericho during World War One. They occupied it and built, you know, army camps and fortified them and that sort of thing. Okay, and they built them with the help of a Jewish company. Kind of interesting. So there was a Jewish entrepreneur. I didn't know this either. There's a Jewish entrepreneur in Jericho who's helping the British build forts. I wonder how that went down at home. Okay, but anyway, and the bridges. All the bridges in Jericho, to Jericho now, they were all rigged with explosives because they thought the German allies were going to come in and try and take it back. And in 1927, yet another earthquake affected Jericho and a lot of other cities in the area. About 300 people died. During the 1948 Arab-Jewish War, which most of you are probably too young to remember, I remember it vaguely, Jericho was occupied by Transjordan being what is now Jordan, okay? And the Jericho Conference, which was organized by King Abdullah, who ruled that part of the world, had about 2,000 Palestinian delegates. So even then, there was a big force out there. And in 1948, they proclaimed His Majesty Abdullah as King of all Palestine and called for the unification of Palestine and Transjordan, so Palestine and Jordan together, step towards full Arab unity. Well, that didn't sit well with the occupying powers. So, in mid-1950, Jordan formally annexed. In other words, it said, oh, by the way, that's ours now. Okay? And annexed the West Bank and Jericho residents, right? And if you know where it looked on the map, if you've done your homework since we've been doing this, if you look on the map, Jericho is a long way from the West Bank. But there it is, okay? They annexed the West Bank, and Jericho residents, like other residents out there, became Jordanian citizens. Well then, here we go again. Jericho was occupied by the Israelis during the Six-Day War in 1967, along with the rest of the bank. So back it went again, okay? And it was the first city, something to recognize. If you're not following what happens in Jerusalem, in Jericho today, well, in Jerusalem, in Palestine today, you'll miss this. But it was the first city handed over to the Palestinian Authority control in accordance with the Oslo Accords. Jimmy Carter and that sort of time. We look this up in the history books. Nothing about this in the Bible, of course, but it's interesting to see where it goes. And the limited self-rule of Jericho was agreed in the Gaza-Jericho agreement of, 94. Now, you have to understand this. Jericho, if you look at the map, here's Israel, right? Jericho's here, Gaza's here. They're miles apart, a long distance apart. Both of them governed by Palestinians. The rest of Israel is Israel. There's a road that joins them, and it makes a interesting story. I don't know how much time we got left, but not enough to go through it. But bear in mind then, let me finish up with this. You might look at your current day maps. You got Gaza Strip here, which we all know about. You know, all the fighting and everything that's gone on for years and years and years. And over here you got Jericho, and you got a road between them. This is Palestine. This is Palestinians. This is Palestinians. This is Israelis. Does it remind you of something else? Judah, the Israel, and the people in between. Remember the old story about the Samaritan? Same sort of thing, divided by another country. We'll get into it in a bit more detail. Until then, just keep your Bible handy because we're going to get really into it when we start the next city, okay? Till then, good night. God bless.